Welcome to my channel. In this lecture, I'll be looking at the olfactory pathway. This is a neural connection that is responsible for the sense of smell. So ride on with me as I unfold the structural configuration of the olfactory pathway. The olfactory pathway, we say that it's responsible for the integration and the perception of smell. And the nerve that is responsible for this perception is the olfactory nerve. This is the first cranial nerve, and the olfactory nerve also is a sensory nerve. And in trying to understand the olfactory pathway, I would like to divide the olfactory pathway into two subdivisions that it is made up of. So using this image here and creating a demarcation at this level bordered in dotted yellow. This level is the level where we have the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone. We've tried to establish the structural configuration of the cribriform plate of the ethmoid in our previous lecture on the ethmoid bone. So at this level where we have the cribriform plate of ethmoid demarcates the olfactory pathway into the nasal olfactory component, and this nasal olfactory component, as the name implies, it is within the nasal cavity, and this is the region here at the inferior part of this demarcation. And if you go more superiorly above the demarcation, we have the central olfactory component, which of course is related to the central nervous system. And this is the region here above this demarcation. And we'll try and take each of these subcomponents one after the other to see the structural events that occur within this space. So going further, let's look at the nasal olfactory component. We've established in our previous slide that the nasal olfactory component is the region that is located inferior to the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone. And of course, this region is where the olfactory pathway begins from. This is the initial point where the olfactory pathway is initiated. Let's look at the events that occur within the nasal olfactory component and see what occurs that tends to initiate the process of olfaction. The first event or activity that must occur within the nasal olfactory component is the transmission of odorant. So odorant must enter through the nose rays. We know that the nose rays are the spaces that are seen within the nose. And of course, this odorant will enter through it and be directed into the olfactory segment of the nasal cavity. The odorant can also pass through the oral cavity because there's a link between the oral cavity and the nasal cavity up here through the nasopharynx. So this odorant can also be seen to be directed into the olfactory segment of the nasal cavity through the oral cavity. So using this image here, let's try and illustrate the region where the olfactory segment is specifically located. So this is where we have the nose rays through which the odorant pass through before it can get access into the olfactory segment of the nasal cavity. So you also have it being directed and dissolving into the mucus of the olfactory segment of the nasal cavity. This odorant will need to dissolve so that there will be easy trapping of the particles by the olfactory receptors. So talking about the general configuration of the nasal cavity, from this region here, demarcated here in green, is where we have the nasal cavity, and inferiorly we have the oral cavity that is separated by the hard palate at the front and posteriorly by the soft palate. So this is the entire configuration of the nasal cavity. The nasal cavity is also further subdivided into two, and of course this demarcation is created with this dotted red, and the region that is located above this region is the olfactory segment, which means that the olfactory segment is seen at the roof of the nasal cavity. Because if this is the entire nasal cavity and the olfactory segment here is located above this point, it means that it is located at the roof or the upper part of the nasal cavity, while the remaining region down is the respiratory segment. And the olfactory segment couldn't have been located anywhere else apart from the roof or the superior part of the nasal cavity, because after this region, the next region or space where the olfactory nerve will be directed to is into the cranial cavity. And this is where the cranial cavity is located above up here. So it cannot be located or seen in any other region apart from the region that is close to where we have the cranial cavity. So you see that the nasal cavity is also further subdivided, trying to distinct its regions into spaces that are created for both olfactory function and also respiratory function. So when the odorant pass through the nose ridge, it is directed into the olfactory segment, because this is the region where we have the olfactory nerve. The olfactory nerve is not seen in the respiratory segment. It is positioned at this region. And that is why the odorant will be directed towards the olfactory segment, where the trapping of the particles will be done. So as it's directed here, when it gets to this region, this odorant will be dissolved in the mucus lining the olfactory segment of the nasal cavity. In the olfactory segment, at this region here, we have mucus. And of course, it is dissolved within the mucus. And this process of dissolving the odorant in the mucus is to enhance the trapping of these particles by the olfactory receptors. We have olfactory receptors located within the olfactory segment. And of course, they need to trap these particles into them so that it will be directed or further into the central olfactory pathway. So let's go further by driving into the histology or the microscopic configuration of the olfactory segment. If you look at the olfactory segment, this segment is made up of a number of olfactory cells, and these cells are distinct and of course are designed for different functions. So within the olfactory segment, as we stated in our previous slide, we already know where the olfactory segment is located within the nasal cavity. And within this region, we have a number of cells. And this is the region here that is carved out in black. So this region is where we have the olfactory segment. If you look deep into this region, you see that you have a number of cells. And of course, it is important for us to highlight these cells in establishing the olfactory pathway. So the first cell that is seen within this region is the olfactory epithelium. We know that in the nasal cavity, the specific type of epithelium that is seen within this region is a pseudo-stratified columnar type of epithelium. This is a respiratory epithelium. This is the type of epithelium that is seen along the respiratory tract. And of course, this is also seen within the nasal cavity. But specifically within the region where we have the olfactory segment, we also have this type of epithelium. And if you look at this image up here, this is where we have the olfactory epithelium that is harrowed here in purple. If you look at this image down here, which of course is a more enlarged image, this is where we have the olfactory epithelium, also harrowed here in purple. If you look at it, this is a pseudo-stratified columnar type of epithelium. Going through our previous lecture on the epithelium, by now we should be able to establish the configuration of the pseudo-stratified columnar type of epithelium. They are falsely stratified, having a columnar configuration. So this is what is harrowed here in purple. These epithelium linings, what they do basically is to give structural and metabolic support for the olfactory receptor cells. So if you look at it, you see that they are trying to create a structural framework around the olfactory segment. So this is what the olfactory epithelium presents. They are also referred to as the sustentacular cell or the neural supporting cell. Just as the name implies, they give structural support to the olfactory segment. So the second type of cell that we see is the olfactory sensory cell. These are also referred to as the olfactory receptor cells. If you look at this image up here, this is where we have the olfactory sensory cell that is harrowed here in black. Using a more enlarged image down here, this is where we have the olfactory receptor cell or the sensory cell. These are the main cells that are responsible for transmitting smell signal. If you look at this cell, you see that they are embedded or positioned within the olfactory epithelium that we initially described. So you see that the olfactory epithelium cell is helping to hold or give a structural support for the olfactory sensory cell, the main cell of the olfactory pathway. And of course, they are highly sensitive and they need to be well supported and also guided. And that is why they are protected by the olfactory epithelium cell. These olfactory sensory cells are bipolar neurons. We know that neurons basically can either be multipolar, which means this kind of configuration here. Multipolar neural cells have numerous extensions from the cell body. This is where we have the cell body, and you see that you have numerous extensions from the cell body, and this is a multipolar type of neuron. If you go to the second type of neuron, this is a bipolar type of neuron. And it is bipolar because it has just two extensions from the neural cell body. This is where we have the neural cell body. This is one extension up here, and this is another extension down here. Then the third type of neuron is the unipolar neuron, which means that we have just one extension from the neural cell body. This is the neural cell body, and this is one extension, of course, that emerges from the neural cell body. And this, of course, can further subdivide into different subregions. So we have neurons being presented as a multipolar, bipolar, and also unipolar. But specifically, the bipolar type of neuron is what is seen in the olfactory segment. This bipolar neuron, which means that they have two extensions, one going above and of course one coming below. And this is the kind of configuration that is seen by the olfactory receptor cells within the olfactory segment. And this is what is highlighted here in black. So if you look at it, it has two extensions. One is extending above and one is extending below. And of course, they are being sandwiched within the olfactory epithelium. So this is helping to hold them in place, giving them structural support. We've also stated that these cells have two extensions. We have an extension at the inferior part. And if you look at the inferior configuration of this bipolar neuron, you see that there's a thickening around the inferior axonal extension. And this is what is highlighted here in black. And this region is referred to as the olfactory node. This further increases by expanding. And this expansion here is what is referred to as the olfactory knob, to create an increased surface area so that the cilia can line on it, thereby increasing the number of cilia that will be seen on the surface of the olfactory knob, because it has now expanded, thereby increasing the surface area for this attachment to occur. These expansions are so created to allow for the lining of the olfactory cilia. These cilia are about 20 in number. They are non-motile cilia, and you see them running along the surface of the olfactory knob. And this is what is highlighted here in black. And as this extension is seen at the surface of the olfactory knob, you see that they extend into the olfactory mucus. We said that within the olfactory segment, we have mucus, and this mucus is to help dissolve the odorants. And of course, these particles, as it dissolves, is going to enhance the trapping mechanism of the olfactory cilia that is seen to line onto the surface of the olfactory knob. So the essence of this cilia is to drive into the mucus, and also helping to trap the particles that are already dissolved within the olfactory mucus. So that is how it is established at this inferior part. So if you try to go up here, you also see this configuration there. This is the olfactory mucus here, highlighted here in dotted black. And you see that there's an extension of the olfactory receptor cells. And you see that the cilia at this inferior part extend into this mucus layer. And of course, within this mucus layer, we already have the dissolved odorant. So these particles will be trapped by this cilia that is seen to line onto the surface of the olfactory knob. Because we say it's a bipolar neuron, this is an inferior axonal extension. There's going to be a superior extension. So this superior extension at the upper part also goes, and this is what is directed up into the cranial cavity. So if you use this image here, we already have the inferior extension, and by now we know the details of events that occur around this place. So going to the upper extension, this is the upper axonal extension, and what is seen here are divisions. You have different subdivisions into olfactory rootlets, and this rootlets is what is collected as the olfactory nerve. We will be seeing the details of this as we go through with this lecture. So looking at this image up here, we say that the superior extension, and this is what is highlighted here in red. So you have a collection from this upper part from the different olfactory receptor cells coming together at the superior part here to form the olfactory nerve. This olfactory nerve will then be directed into the cranial cavity, because above the cribriform plate here, This region that is seen above this space is the cranial cavity, specifically the anterior cranial fossa, where further progression will occur. We said that we have the olfactory epithelium, we have the olfactory sensory cells solely responsible for the perception of smell. We also have other types of cells within the olfactory segment. We have the Bowman's gland. This Bowman's gland is a serous type of gland. This region here that is harrowed in yellow is the Bowman's gland, and the Bowman's gland is responsible for secreting serous fluid so that more of the odorant will be dissolved in a more liquefied environment. So this is the essence of this Bowman's gland, because it is a serous secreting gland which will enhance the process of trapping the dissolved odorant around this region. So another type of cell that is seen are the basal cells. These are the basal cells here, harrowed in black. The basal cells are also referred to as the stem cell or the progenitor cells, which means that these cells will further develop or be transformed into another type of cell. And if you look at this image up here, this is where we have the basal cell or the stem cell. This cell can also be referred to as the progenitor cell. So as these cells are created here, they will be transformed into the olfactory sensory cell. This is where we have the olfactory sensory cell here. We said that they are the main target cell for the initiation of smell. These olfactory sensory cells have a very short lifespan, which ranges from 30 to 60 days. And if they have this short lifespan, it means that they should be replaced for the process of the perception of smell to continue. And what is responsible for replacing these cells are the basal cell. So as the olfactory receptor cell fades out, there's going to be a continuous replacement by the basal cell. And this is what this cell is responsible for. This replacement is not 100% efficient, so it cannot be fully compensated for. This means that the number of the olfactory receptor cells that are lost as a result of the short lifespan that they have, they are not going to be fully replaced by the basal cell. And this is what is responsible, or the reduction in the sense of smell as we age. Because this replacement cannot be 100% efficient, some of the olfactory receptor cell will not be replaced at the end of the day. This will lead to a decrease or a decline in the sensation of smell as we age. So this can be used as a justification for this. Going back to the nasal olfactory segment, having described the different types of cells that are located within the olfactory segment of the nasal cavity, we have the trapping mechanism of this dissolved odorant or chemicals that is inhaled or taken through the nostrils. It can also go through the oral cavity because there is a link around the nasopharynx through which this odorant can go upward, where they finally enter into the nasal cavity, and of course will be directed towards the olfactory segment. So it is not only through the nostrils that the odorant can pass through, they can also pass through the oral cavity, which means that the sense of smell can also be established through the passage of the odorant through the oral cavity, because there is a space behind through the nasopharynx where this odorant can eventually enter into the nasal cavity, and of course will be directed to the olfactory segment. So describing the event here that is harrowed in green, which is of course is a trapping mechanism of the non-motile cilia that you see on the surface of the olfactory knob. An action potential is generated, and this is directed through this olfactory receptor and is directed through this part that is harrowed here in green. And you see it's going up, they are collected around the rootlets of the superior axonal extension. And using this image by the side here, you see that the region that is harrowed here in blue is where we have the collection of the olfactory rootlets. And this is what becomes the olfactory nerve. So this is where we have the olfactory nerve. As this sensory stimuli collected, it is directed up to enter into the cranial cavity. And this direction cannot just occur because we have a bone here that is referred to as the cribriform plate of ethmoid bone. This cribriform plate of ethmoid are seen with foramina within it. These foramina are so created to allow the path through which the olfactory nerve will run and enter into the cranial cavity. If you look at it, we have O's created here, and this is what is harrowed here in yellow. And above this region is where we have the cranial cavity, so that the olfactory nerve will be able to enter into it and, of course, be directed accordingly to the specific region where further progression will occur. So this is what happens within the olfactory segment. And of course, this is the first initial segment of the olfactory pathway, and we'll try to highlight a number of events that occur within this region. So going further to the central olfactory component, we said that the olfactory pathway is divided into the nasal olfactory component and the central olfactory component. The central olfactory component is within the central nervous system. Remember when we stopped in our previous slide, we said that the olfactory nerves are now being developed as axonal end of the olfactory receptor cell. And this, of course, enter through the foramina created on the cribriform plate of ethmoid before they can access the cranial cavity. So what now happens within the cranial cavity? So as this olfactory nerve enter into the cranial cavity, they enter into a structure that appears to be bulb-like, and this is referred to as the olfactory bulb. This region that is harrowed here in yellow is where we have the emergence of the olfactory nerve within the cranial cavity. So within the cranial cavity, this olfactory nerve is then directed into the olfactory bulb. And this is where we have the olfactory bulb here harrowed at this region. So this olfactory bulb is like a bulb-like structure that is seen on top of the cribriform plate. Remember, this is where we have the cribriform plate of ethmoid, and this bulb is located at the superior part of the cribriform plate of ethmoid bone. There are also a number of events that occur within the olfactory bulb. So let's dive into the olfactory bulb and see the activities that is being exhibited by the olfactory nerve. So the olfactory bulb, we have two. We have one on the right, we have one on the left. We know that we have a superior extension of the cribriform plate of ethmoid that is referred to as the crystal galley. The crystal galley, then on both sides is where we have the cribriform plate of ethmoid. On both cribriform plate of ethmoid is where we have the olfactory bulb. So let's try and use this image here for illustration. This is the interior view or the internal view of the cranial cavity. This is the anterior cranial fossa, this is the middle cranial fossa, and this is the posterior cranial fossa. It is in the anterior cranial fossa that we have the olfactory bulb, because the anterior cranial fossa is what is seen to be located above the nasal cavity. So inferior to this region, definitely we'll be having the nasal cavity at the inferior part. So this region up here, arrowed in yellow, is where we have the cribriform plate of ethmoid, and we have another one on the other side. And in between the cribriform plate of ethmoid, we have the crystal galley that is arrowed here in red. The crystal galley is a superior extension. This extension is driven into the anterior cranial fossa, and this is what is presented here in this image. And this means that the olfactory bulb will be located in this region that is highlighted here in red. So you have the olfactory bulb here on both sides. You have one on this side and you have another one on the other side. So you see it's located at the upper part or the superior part of the cribriform plate of ethmoid. Well, of course, it will be located on the lateral side of the crystal galley. And this is what is captured here in this image. So if you have one olfactory bulb here, you'll be having another olfactory bulb at the other side. And at the middle, you now have the crystal galley. The olfactory bulb is not only located at the base or the inferior part of the frontal lobe of the cerebrum hemisphere, it is also seen to be located around the midline plane. Because if you look at this image up here, inferior to this space is where we have the nasal cavity. And of course, the nasal cavity is seen around the midline plane. So above it, where we have the cribriform plate of ethmoid, which forms the roof of the nasal cavities, where we have the placement of the olfactory bulb. So this olfactory bulb, as it is seen at the inferior part of the frontal lobe, it is also seen to be located around the midline plane. So if you look at this configuration here, this is where we have the frontal lobe, this is where we have the temporal lobe, and posteriorly we have the occipital lobe. In the frontal lobe, at the base of the frontal lobe, the structure that is seen, that is harrowed in yellow, is the olfactory bulb. If you look at this image up here, in the anterior cranial fossa, the specific lobe that is seen in this space is the frontal lobe of the cerebrum hemisphere. So the base of the frontal lobe is where you have olfactory bulb. The olfactory bulb, as it is seen at the base of the frontal lobe of the cerebral hemisphere, it is also seen to be positioned close to the midline plane because the cribriform plate of ethmoid is seen along this part. Let's try and drive further to see the events that occur within the olfactory bulb. We've tried to establish the specific position of the olfactory bulb. So within this structure here that is arrowed here and highlighted in blue, we have events that occur within the olfactory bulb. So in the olfactory bulb, we have synapses between the olfactory nerve, which of course is taken as the first order neuron, and this synapse will occur with the second order neuron. This second order neuron are referred to as the mitral nerve or the tuft nerve. These two nerves are the nerves that are seen as the second order neuron, and this is what forms a synapse with the olfactory sensory or receptor cell. And this synapse occur at the specific region here that is arrowed in white, and this region is referred to as the glomerulus. This region here that is highlighted. So we have a collection of this structure within the olfactory bulb. We have events of synapses occurring within this point. So there is a synapse between the first order neuron and also the second order neuron. After the synapse, there's going to be the emergence of the olfactory tract, and this is what is arrowed here in black. So you now have axonal extension from the second order neuron being collected as the olfactory tract. It is this tract that is further driven and terminated on the olfactory cortex before the perception of smell will then be activated. So this is how it runs within the anterior cranial fossa. So when you see the olfactory bulb, the events that occur within this point are the formation of glomeruli. And within the glomeruli, we have synaptic points between the first order neuron and the second order neuron. And by now, we know what the first and the second order neurons are within the olfactory pathway. It's also good to add that we have the granule cell. These granule cells are GABA releasing cells. These are inhibitory cells of the olfactory pathway. And this is the granule cell here, highlighted in yellow. You see this cell forming a synapse or a connect with the first order neuron and also the second order neuron. And this is the way they are connected at this region. These cells are responsible for inhibiting the olfactory pathway, because you know that there are times that the olfactory pathway is not activated. It cannot activate the sense of smell. The odorant will be directed towards the nose rays and of course dissolved within this mucous layer, but the activation of smell signals will not be affected. This is as a result of the inhibitory action that is generated by the granule cell. So when the perception of smell is not activated, it's as a result of the inhibitory action from the granule cell. So you will not be able to smell a particular odor as a result of this inhibition. So it's also good for us to highlight this. So this is the peculiarity that is seen within the olfactory pathway, whereby some circumstances will affect the sense of smell. And this will occur as a result of the inhibitory action from the granule cell. So also going further now on the central olfactory pathway, we now have the generation of the olfactory bulb, which of course will lead to the generation of the olfactory tract. So the collection of the olfactory tract is what is directed towards the olfactory sensory cortex for the perception of smell to be activated. So we have this olfactory tract as it emerges after the formation of the olfactory bulb. This is where we have the frontal lobe, this is where we have the temporal lobe, and posteriorly we have the occipital lobe. So as it emerges, this olfactory tract needs to be directed posteriorly. You know that the frontal lobe of the cerebral cortex is located in the anterior part, and we have the olfactory cortex, which of course are a collection of structures located around the base of the temporal lobe. It is located around the base of the temporal lobe. It means that the olfactory tract will need to be directed posteriorly so as to be able to assume the position where we have the olfactory cortex. So it is directed posteriorly to attain that position. So as it goes more posteriorly, there's a specific region where the olfactory tract will become widened and thickened, and it forms a triangular configuration. And at this point is where we have the olfactory trigon. This olfactory trigon, you can see that as the olfactory tract emerges after the formation of the olfactory bulb here, it now begins begins to widen, giving this kind of three-sided configuration. And at this point is where it's referred to as the olfactory trigon. After the formation of the olfactory trigon, around specific region where we have the optic chiasma, the optic chiasma is highlighted in dotted red, and this is the region where we have the crossing of the optic nerves, and also the region where we have the anterior perforated substance. This is where we have the anterior perforated substance. You see this structure perforated as a result of small vessels running through this structure. You have this perforated appearance. And these 2 points is used to establish the specific region where we have the olfactory trigon dividing into the lateral olfactory stria and also the medial olfactory stria. So this is where we have the lateral olfactory stria that is arrowed here going on the lateral side. And we have the medial olfactory stria here also directed medially. So after the formation of the olfactory trigon, around the region where we have the anterior perforated substance and also the optic chiasma, we have it dividing into two. And as it divides into two, we have one stria running laterally and another one running medially. So these two divisions, of course, are directed to the olfactory cortex. It's also good for us to add that we have the olfactory sulcus or the olfactory groove. This olfactory sulcus or groove is an indentation that is created around the inferior or the base of the frontal lobe of the cerebrum hemisphere. And this indentation is created by the olfactory bulb and also the olfactory tract that is generated after the formation of the olfactory bulb. So you see that there's an indentation created around the inferior part of the frontal lobe. And this indentation is a groove that is referred to as the olfactory groove or the olfactory sulcus. So it's also good for us to establish this. So going further, after the division into the lateral and the medial stria, the lateral stria will run to the olfactory cortex. And of course, the olfactory cortex will say that it is a collection of regions actually located at the base of the temporal lobe. And that is the reason why the olfactory tract initially is driven or directed posteriorly, so as to assume that position. So after the division into the lateral and the medial olfactory stria, this is the lateral olfactory stria, and of course, is directed to a collection of regions that are referred to as the olfactory cortex. So the first region that is sent fibers to is the peripheral cortex. This is what is arrowed here in red. The peripheral cortex is located deep to the temporal lobe. This is the main olfactory center. This is where the perception is mainly generated from. Then the second region where it is directed is the entorhinal cortex. This is what is arrowed here in blue. The entorhinal cortex is located at the deep medial aspect of the temporal lobe. And this is finally directed to the hippocampus. The hippocampus is responsible for the memory aspect of smell. There are times where you have perceived a particular type of smell and you can remember that this has been perceived before. So you can recollect that this is something that I have experienced before in terms of smell. So this is like a memory center for the perception of smell. Then the next region is the amygdala. The amygdala is also located at the deep part of the temporal lobe of the cerebrum hemisphere. And this is what is arrowed here in green. So some fibers are also directed from the lateral olfactory stria to the amygdala. And this is responsible for the emotional perception of smell. There are times that a particular type of smell is perceived, and of course, it tends to change our emotion. At times you become happy, at times you become sad. This is attributed to the fact that some fibers of the lateral olfactory stria are also directed to the amygdala, which of course is the emotional hub. And this is related to the emotional perception of smell. The medial olfactory stria, we already described the specific region where the lateral olfactory stria will be terminated on, which of course a collection of a number of regions are located at the base of the temporal lobe. So for the medial olfactory stria, of course, this is directed through the anterior commissure, where it crosses to the olfactory structures on the other side. So at this point is where we have the medial olfactory stria here that is arrowed here, and you see it being directed to the olfactory structure on the other side. And this is where crossing occurs. And this crossing, of course, allows for the perception of smell. Even though one nostril is closed, the perception of smell can still be felt on the other side of the brain because of this crossing from one side to the contralateral side. So this is where this perception is initiated. haven't studied the olfactory pathway and also a number of other pathways. What is distinct about the olfactory pathway? The olfactory pathway is distinct in the sense that it does not intersect on the thalamus. If you go through the other pathway, you see that they are intersected on the thalamus before they are finally terminated on the cerebral cortex, where the perception will be felt. Then the second is that the olfactory nerve, which is the sole sensory nerve of the olfactory pathway, can regenerate. And this is attributed to the short lifespan of the olfactory nerve. And after they degenerate, there's going to be the regeneration of this nerve through the basal cell. We said that the basal cell are the stem cell or the progenitor cell that is transformed into the sensory, olfactory, or receptor cells. And this is how these cells regenerate. If you go back to the nasal component of the olfactory pathway, we said that the olfactory nerve will emerge as rootlets of the olfactory receptor cells, and this will pass through the cribriform plate of Echtemed before it finally enters into the anterior cranial fossa. So if you look at the position of the olfactory nerve and how it emerges, you see that it is linked to the external environment. And of course, it is exposed to injury or insult. So as it degenerates, it can also regenerate through the basal stem cell that are seen in the olfactory segment of the nasal cavity. Also, the olfactory cortex, where there is final termination of the olfactory tract. Remember that after the formation of the olfactory bulb, we have the emergence of the olfactory tract. It is this olfactory tract that finally terminates on the olfactory cortex. The olfactory cortex for the olfactory pathway is a collection of regions that are seen to receive fibers from the olfactory tract. For the olfactory pathway, it is a collection of subregions that are seen at the base of the temporal lobe of the cerebral hemisphere. So it's a collection of a number of regions, and this collection is taken as the olfactory cortex. Then lastly, the olfactory cortex is associated with emotions and also memory, because the lateral striae that is formed from the termination or the division of the olfactory tract are terminated finally on specific regions that are responsible for memory and also emotional perceptions. So let's look at clinical anatomy. And the first one I want to look at is anosmia. Anosmia is the lack of the ability to perceive smell. When you lose the ability to smell, this is referred to anosmia. And this can occur as a result of infection or maybe trauma when you have an accident or injury that, of course, affects different structures of the olfactory system. Alzheimer's or other neurodegenerative diseases have been linked to loss of smell. This is because the olfactory regions are affected when these diseases occur. So let's check our understanding of this lecture through the following questions. And the first one is to explain the nasal component of the olfactory pathway. Remember when we started this lecture, we tried to divide the olfactory pathway into a nasal component and a central component. So you're asked to explain this. Also describe the histology of the olfactory cells. Within the olfactory segment, we have a number of cells that are designed for a number of functions. So you try and describe the histology of these cells. Also, the third question is to describe the central component of the olfactory pathway. This also should come easy. So thanks for watching this video. Let's continue to stay glued to this channel.